Hello and welcome to the Angerati studio here at EMART. I'm joined now by Filip Sleeuwagen, who's head of commercial affairs at EFET, or have I just promoted you? Or
That's correct.
That's
Fully
correct.
correct.
Yeah. Firstly, welcome to the
you.
studio. Thanks for making the time. And Filip, can you tell us a little bit about EFET and your role there and what it is that you do before we go into the rest of the interview?
Okay, sure, thanks. EFET stands for the European Federation of Energy Traders. It's in fact an organization that is consisting of more than 100 market participants active in energy or commodity trading. And it's actually actively focusing on two different activities. There's policy and lobbying work, let me describe it that way, and there's an important standardization arm. Standardization arm, and this is where I'm slowly getting into the territory I'm working on, is looking at legal terms, standardization of contracts and legal opinions, and secondly, standardization of processes and IT tools. And the last part, so the process and IT tools, is the kind of standardization area that I'm working in. If you would wonder how that coincides with commercial affairs, there's a strange coordination around it, which actually is based on the fact that those standardization projects are offered as services as well. Those services have a commercial context, and that's also one of my kind of areas of expertise.
Right, okay. And so that's really useful. And then let's rewind a little bit, because again, you've implemented certain standards and protocols, whatever you want to call it. And if I can ask you for a second to just rewind and tell us a little bit about the sort of lessons learned from implementing the REMIT and EMIR, and just if you could bring that to life for us a little bit about that journey.
Okay, surely can. I think regulations, I don't think they need introduction. They're on every agenda, on every fair, every event, and every meeting probably for the last, well, over 2 years now. What within EFET I've been working on is the actual impact of implementing such regulations. Obviously there's a policy level, there's a strategic level. I'm not talking about that one, I'm talking about the operational aspect of having to comply with regulations. That started in 2012 until 2014 with EMIR, and this year, as of October 7, a first part of the REMIT regulation went live, and by live I mean activated the need for operational reporting for market participants.
So what are the key tenets of these regulations? What is it that they're trying to achieve? I mean,
so
there must be an output.
There's two different aspects to this. The EMIR regulation looks at ensuring and securing the quality of the energy markets, and looks at a way to make sure that anyone who invests or is active in this market is kind of entering into a secure market, which basically means that the operational aspects of this is not the principal, the reporting part, which I'm focusing on, is not the principal element of such a regulation. It's more of a side effect that sits alongside the guidance on how the market should operate. Typical things like forced clearing and risk mitigation techniques that describe how a market could work better is actually a different aspect than the implementation of the reporting requirements that exist as well under an EMIR regulation. That is one aspect for EMIR. A totally different purpose of REMIT as a regulation is to seek transparency, to seek integrity and transparency, where they focus on allowing a regulator to check that anyone active in this market is honest and fair about his participation in this market, his activity in the market, and therefore has to report all of his activities to ensure that those activities do not infringe or impact any, I would say, abuse or hinder the good functioning of such commodity markets.
And then I would imagine if you're a regulator, you kind of want that information in some sort of standard way, don't you?
Exactly.
You don't want to get it in 10 different formats and all that sort of stuff.
So that's an interesting concept, because we could expect, and now when I say we, I talk in EFET terms, which basically means market participants. We could expect that over different regulations, we, the industry and the regulators, would have learned from implementing several regulations. Started with Dodd-Frank in the US, the next one was EMIR in Europe, followed by REMIT. Unfortunately, I would say that we haven't learned that much. The concept has changed from a kind of intermediate reporting level, where for EMIR, it's not the regulator who owns the data or who hosts a data source. It's different commercial organizations who offer as a service that hosting and collection of data. They're called trade repositories. In REMIT, the regulator Acer opted for another approach where it's Acer themselves who receive the data. Hence the need to have a clearly formulated standard, open standard, by which the data is then communicated in one uniform way. That's already a step forward compared to what has been done in EMIR, but there's still a long way to go. We see that in the implementation of those regulations over time, a lot of the specificities or a lot of the requirements for implementation actually only pop up when people start to implement, which basically means that the preparation work, that the legislative information that is available is not sufficient to actually have correct implementation and a good quality of the data.
So one of the things that I pick up on in your answer is that we haven't learned the lessons. And are you specifically talking about learning the lessons of standardization of data and standardization of reporting, or
it boils down to that.
Yes.
I think there's obviously the buzzwords of open standards and market standards and market practice. In this case, we're talking about the need to have an integrated view on activities throughout a market and throughout a large number of market participants. The only way to ensure that, and the only way to have an efficient implementation, is to use market standards on both the data and on the processes. That there has been a lot of work done on that to make it progress towards an understandable level of standardization for process and for data, but still today we experience a lot of difficulties when implementing it in a lot of open answers, a lot of Q&As that are actually needed to complete what sits in the regulatory text, etc. There is a market standard for it, for the data at least. It's called CPML, Commodity Product Markup Language, which is in fact a industry initiative. It's a complete independent industry initiative whereby the purpose is to describe transactions and transaction elements into a standardized way that would fit all regulations.
So it removes ambiguity.
It removes ambiguity. It agrees. It makes the definitions agreeable to everybody who wants to implement it, both from a delivering data as from a receiving data part, and it is supported by by a wide part of the industry, not just traders but also brokers, exchanges, TRs, and software vendors. So it's supposed to be the open. It's supposed to be the if I can call a brand name, the Linux approach to commodity trade data.
Because it surprises me that. We're kind of somewhat still in that world, because I would imagine that if you drive through the standards, you can, compliance has an impact on back office and front office operations and so on.
Yep.
But the more you can drive through standards, the less you reduce the cost of operations, don't you? I mean,
absolutely.
That's the point.
Absolutely. But I think what we need to take into account here is that the actual, let me call it digital or standardization maturity of the commodity world isn't that big. When I started to work in this era, which is about 2002, the vast majority of trades were confirmed by fax. Right. Which is, if you look, I come from finance. Fax was never used anymore.
Yeah.
I always make the joke.
There was some machine in the corner saying,
the first fax was ever sent in 1856, and we were still using that technology in 2002. So I think bearing in mind that starting to automate basic processes, which is about to compare data, which took a long time because the first questions to be addressed or to answered were, how do we describe peak? What commodities do we have? Is that electricity? Is it power? Is it elec? Is it, how do we? So we had to go through all the basic steps of standardization. IFE did a lot of work on that, so that finally, like 10 years later, if you go into regulatory reporting, there was already a sound basis to actually make sure we could describe transactions nearly to the extent of what the regulators were looking for, and then had to embed that onto the process of regulatory reporting as described by the regulator. One thing to address additionally on your question was that why do we still have to do this, and how come it doesn't apply already as a standard, things like reporting? I think there's several reasons for that. The first thing is that the regulations as such are issued by different regulators for different purposes, and also, and certainly for EMIR, EMIR is not only looking at energy or commodities, but looking at all asset classes, which basically means that the data model they use is something that should fit to all asset classes. Unfortunately, for this purpose or for EMIR, energy is not just another asset class, it's a quite specific one. And so when it becomes specific, you all of a sudden fall out of the standardization approach to try to harmonize everything into one bit and piece. That doesn't work.
Isn't almost, and I'm probably going to be somewhat facetious here, that the regulators need to standardize themselves before everybody else can get the...
Yes, it would make sense to do that, certainly because 3 years later, another regulation pops up who basically asks for very similar, if not identical data to the same companies for different purpose. I do fully agree, but they're asking for the same thing the same way, yet slightly differently formulated, but to the same people again. So the same parties have all of a sudden to implement two different processes which actually should fit the same purpose of doing reporting. This is where EFIT steps in to try to shield the entire marketplace from these variances, because in the end it's variance that achieve the same purpose of reporting, and that actually creates a common interface so that market participants will only have to report once a trade, so it can afterwards be sent to the appropriate either the regulator, either the TR or the mechanics in between that serve the regulator as to collect the data.
Do you know what? As you're talking, the only thing that's going through my head is something like XML. You know, where you have this is what it is, and this is the description of the attribute. This is what it is.
Exactly.
Is that kind of?
That is the buzzword. Now XML is a technology element that is actually used to make sure that you can describe, let me call it data structures, without having an interference between the content and the structure, right? So if I said I've referred to CPML before, it's not by accident that the elements ML and XML are corresponding to the same. So CPML is a bespoke implementation of XML for commodity transactions. And by the way, what Acer has been implementing in Remit is a proprietary Acer standard, but it uses XML as well. And there's a nearly a one-to-one link to what CPML has been doing. The only difference is that CPML looks at more than one regulation, therefore is wider a scope.
Right.
But what we have implemented from an EFIT perspective is the assurance that if a company implements CPML, that allows you to, within one trade message, submit elements to different regulators. So it's one time to send the information to your service provider, who dismisses it to the different regulators for different regulations. So that is successfully implemented.
So all of that sounds fantastic and sensible, everything. So are you saying we are kind of there or thereabouts with data exchange standardization?
Not yet.
Right.
I think today it's the industry who took the initiative to standardize and harmonize most of the data and of the processes, but we're still into a convincing role that it actually makes sense to use this as the default standard. So we still have to fight the local implementations where regulators don't want to use any standard, still want to go for a proprietary standard. We still have to fight the fact that these standards are not adopted by, for instance, TRs, which basically means that the quality of the EMIR collection of data is suboptimal because there's translations in between. And whereas market participants send the same data, it ends up being translated somewhere else. So there's a reconciliation problem. So we're still in the early days of having to prove that the standardization concept has worked, is working, but should be adopted as much as possible throughout the entire chain. Right now it is implemented at the beginning of the chain to protect and shield market participants from a burden of implementing variance. But our perception is, and our belief is, our strong belief is that it should be implemented throughout the entire chain because it adds value and it makes implementation of requirements a lot more efficient and effective.
It's interesting that the market is forcing this rather than where I've seen in the past where the regulator is going, hey, just can you guys please work to one standard? Yep. Whereas this is almost somewhat the other way around. Yeah.
Absolutely. And where does it come from? I think it comes from a correction factor on the maturity of the regulatory documentation. Whereas I think if you look at Dodd-Frank, the idea there is to have one market standard which is then implemented differently because the specifications were insufficient to avoid interpretations or different variations on what was said. In EMIR, using TRs to collect the data, whereas the standard of data was described by EMIR as the legal text itself, the TRs had the freedom to interpret it differently.
Right.
And it's so only now that explains the ambiguity, and it's only, I would say, now with Remit that you kind of get a combination of all the previous lessons learned by having one standard, because it all goes to one database at the Acer side, which is called ARIS, and that one database is only expecting and accepting one standard information into. Now, why aren't we there then, and isn't this an everybody happy story? Because there's still...
You took the question out of my mouth.
Sorry.
I was like,
it was like the logical consequence, what are we talking about then? We're still not there in having solved all the issues on how much detail need to go into the standardization, how much interpretation need to actually get rid of in order to make this efficient. We have gone a long way. We're still not fully there. We've gone a long way. We have made some. I think we reached a level of success for phase 1 in Remit, which is OMP trades, so it's platform trades, which are by definition more standardized. It's the click and deal, etc.
Yes, yeah.
On the other hand, the next level of complexity is coming in phase 2, where we're talking about OTC trades. And there we have another challenge that right now we really have to go to the bitter end in standardizing and harmonizing, not as such the data models, but now we're onto the data content, right?
Yes.
How are we sure that the structure, we got it nearly, I think, right. It's about a couple of percentages that are left. But now it's about the content, how we make sure that this fits exactly, this is interpreted the same way by everybody using this system. Complexity there is coming from obviously the fact that if we all agree on a standard language, standard content, that doesn't necessarily mean that the definitions used by regulators are the same. And that's another problem. That's where the same field has a different, or the same denominator of a field, label of a field has a different value to different regulators.
And that's why you're probably getting into certain things like the complexities of the English language and stuff like that, which is why we've got a 1,000-year-old penal archive to draw on.
That's what XML is trying to do. It's actually trying to stay away from any language, as in to describe it into a format where there's no discussion about. But even then, there are, and it's not a question about right or wrong, it's a question about making choices, identifying what topics need to be decided on or need to go through a more detailed description and put them on paper. I can give numerous examples, but I mean, just to give you an idea on what we're looking at, it's very, very much detailed. If you describe a trade which is physical, but it only delivers during peak periods, and your trade date actually starts on a Sunday. Is the first date of your contract the Sunday or the Monday? So those kind of things, there's no right or wrong because your physical delivery is on Monday, but your contract is on Sunday. But you need to decide. You need to make sure that everybody does the same thing. That's the level of detail. The
level of detail and those tiny little nuances. So as we're coming to the end of our time, if I can sort of briskly, can you give us an indication of how far are we to complete the job? Are we 80% done? Are we 90% done? What's your sense, or is it worse than that?
My feeling is that on the actual drafting of the standard, the conceptual elements of the standard, we're over 80% done.
Okay.
If we look at the implementation of the standard and the actual way to reap most of the benefits and the fruits out of the standardization work, I don't think we're above 50%. There's far more possible to implement those standards throughout the entire value chain and in a more coherent manner than what we currently do, which is more onto a operational needs element. With the problem, the business process with the biggest impact or the biggest concern operationally gets a part of the standard adopted first. Everything else has to wait. I mean, hopefully after all the avalanche of regulations, there's time to spread out the benefits of the standardization work throughout a larger part of the processes, where in the end the entire commodity space would benefit from.
Perfect. And Philip, on that note, we're going to have to leave it. I think the summary is lots of good work, but a lot of good work left to do, right?
Absolutely.
So that's how we can leave it. Philip, I enjoyed talking to you, and thank you very much for watching this interview. We've got many more to come from EMART talking around issues at the moment in the energy trading space. Thanks again for watching.
Thank you.